We're going to have two keynote speakers this morning. One from Maha Bali, Associate Professor of Practice at the Centre for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo, and her presentation is called Sustaining Intentionally Equitable Learning Communities. Now, we won't take questions immediately to Maha after her session, but we'll go straight on to our second speaker, who is Nora McDuff, OBE, the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Students and Teaching at Solent University, who will be presenting her presentation in narrowing the awarding gap through the adoption of an inclusive curriculum framework. We will then have our Q&A session where both of our speakers will be able to take and answer questions from the floor. I encourage you to use the Q&A box to post your questions, or if you agree with a question that someone else wants to pose, and we'll select those questions to pose to our speakers at the end of their presentations. I now invite Maha to metaphorically, virtually, come onto the stage to do her presentation. Thank you, Maha.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you all for coming and joining me today. It's such an honor to be speaking with you. I'm going to share my screen and turn off my video. As Valerie introduced me, I'm from the American University in Cairo in Egypt, and I also am the co-founder of two intentionally equitable learning communities, which are virtually connecting in Equity Unbound, which I'll talk to you about throughout the presentation today, inshallah. Before I start, assalamu alaikum. How are you feeling today? Could you tell me in the chat? I think in these COVID times, it feels important to always check how people are feeling. We're in this roller coaster of emotions. I always ask my students how they're feeling at the beginning of class, so I want to know how you're feeling today. Blah, yeah, I feel that way. Hi, Ariane, I know you. Bit stressed, too many meetings, yes, mostly occasion. I'm on the ish, I have a lot of ish days. Excited, stressed, walaikum salam, thank you, not so bad. Sun is shining, that's great. We don't know how long that's gonna be. Whoa, worried about Trump, yeah, me too, oh my God. And not so confused, just anxious about the news. I'm very anxious, lucky to be safe, yeah, lucky to be safe for sure. Yeah, the US election news was not nice. And I woke up so many times at night, so I saw the ups and downs, it was hard. Puppy cuddles, that's good. Yeah, it is strange times. Thank you all for sharing how you're feeling today. I hope that this session is useful to you and sort of helps you zone out from everything else that's going on right now. I'm gonna give you the link to my slides, which you can use anytime beyond today. If someone can type it up, because it's hard to move to the chat sometimes. Or let me just post it. So you can keep these for later. If for whatever reason I can't get through them all today, or you want to come back to them, you can always use them again. They're a Creative Commons license, so you can reuse them, just don't sell them. And the session today, I was asked to talk about different frameworks for promoting and assessing social justice in educational interventions. And you'll see that I'll talk about Nancy Fraser and her model, and also intentionally equitable hospitality, which is a model that we developed within Virtually Connecting, which is a hybrid space. And I'm also going to talk about how the connection between promoting agency and ownership and equity when we're dealing with the professional development of educators can influence learning communities for students that have more agency, equity, and so on. So I want to know a little bit about who you are. I don't know who's here in the audience, and I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. So I am an educational developer mainly, and I am also a teacher. I teach a course in intercultural learning and digital literacies, and I am also a parent. So I have a child who's been suffering with this COVID online learning thing. But I've been working in the field of online learning for a really long time. So when COVID happened, my university was, my department was responsible in my university for moving online. So who are you? Tell me something about yourself in the chat. You don't have to put your name if you're not comfortable. Whatever you're comfortable to do, like say what your institution is, or whether you're a student, a teacher, an academic developer, an educational consultant. If you do something completely different, I'd love to have a feel for the room. I see Alyssa saying something about the autumnal colors. What's very funny is that that's actually a spring photo. So those flame trees with the red flowers, these are flowers. It's not the color of the leaves. And they come in the in the springtime. Okay, quality manager, university quality manager in Edinburgh. I'm curious about what that means. Former teachers, PhD students, access and participation and success. All right, the Open University in Scotland student. All right, so we have a good mix of people with different roles, administrative roles, yeah, academic developers as well, all over the UK. I know there are a few people not from the UK at the conference, but I'm assuming the majority are from the UK and from Scotland. Witwatersrand, is that WITS in South Africa? I think so. All right, education consultant. All right, thank you. Nice to meet you. It's good to know a little bit about people who are with us. All right, I love singing as well, and music and laughter. All right, so let me start with Nancy Fraser's model. I don't know if people are familiar with Nancy Fraser's model, and I just realized I didn't put the reference in, but it's easy to find it. And the main thing I like about Nancy Fraser's model of social justice is that she doesn't just focus on the economic dimension, she also includes the cultural and the political dimensions. So the economic dimension is pretty straightforward. So in the context of COVID, it's having access to devices, infrastructure, having a stable income that allows you to learn. The cultural dimension, the problem there that could happen in terms of social justice is that certain cultures are not represented. And I think Nona's presentation will also tackle this issue, is if you have certain cultures not represented, for example, in curriculum. So you have a curriculum from a white perspective that does not tell the stories of indigenous populations or minority populations. And then the political dimension is who has power to set a curriculum, who has power to make decisions about how education will be. And so these are the three types of social justice dimensions that we take into account when we're assessing something. And so I wrote a paper with Catherine Cronin from Ireland and Rajiv Jangani from Canada, talking about open educational practices specifically, and how to look at them from these three different dimensions, keeping in mind that also when you do some kind of educational reform, this reform can happen at a systemic level, which she calls transformative, or it can be at the ameliorative level where you're solving one problem for one person, but not for all people. So it's not a systemic reform. And sometimes the same reform can be positive for one group, but can be negative or neutral for another group. So for example, Wikipedia editing is one pedagogical practice. I don't know if any of you have tried it as students or as teachers. Wikipedia is not a bad source of information. It's just an encyclopedia, so it's not a scholarly source. So economically speaking, Wikipedia is free. So it solves an economic injustice of other encyclopedias that we used to have to pay for, right? However, if someone has no internet access, that's not helping them at all, right? If they have no electricity, how are they going to get online and get to Wikipedia? And then there are ways of sometimes allowing people to, they download offline versions of Wikipedia for them to have, but they won't be able to edit Wikipedia. So they won't have the political power to change what's on Wikipedia, but at least they'll have access to it. The issue, though, is that Wikipedia, and I don't know if others are aware of this, but Wikipedia has a cultural inequality in it, in that there are many more biographies of males and there are many more biographies of white people on it. And this is actually due to the political injustice, which is that the majority of the editors of Wikipedia are white males, and editors on Wikipedia have power to allow or not allow certain content to be on there. The majority of content there in English. That's another cultural problem. Is if you don't speak English, this is a problem. Then the advantages of Wikipedia you don't have. This is just a very quick example of how to use this model. And of course, you'd want to apply this to a lot of other contexts. So I don't know if people are familiar with curriculum theory. Maybe a lot of people who are in the field of education and teaching are familiar with it. I know that when I was doing my PhD at Sheffield, my supervisor was teaching the certificate for teaching and learning in higher education, and he taught curriculum theory. So curriculum can be content-centric or process-centric, right? And teacher-centric or learner-centric, and everything you do can have a pedagogical purpose or social justice purpose. But once you're looking at it from a social justice purpose, you can look at all your content and your processes and everything that you do from these economic, cultural, and political perspectives. So the political perspective one is maybe the most important one. I think that people get wrong when they talk about inclusion. And so what Nancy Fraser talks about is parity of participation. It's not bringing people to the table, and as Desmond Tutu says, giving them the crumbs of compassion thrown from someone who is their master. He wants the full menu of rights. And I would argue beyond what Desmond Tutu says, that we want them to create their own menu, choose their own ingredients. So imagine when you co-create curriculum with students, are you giving them something to work with and telling them these are the Lego blocks that you can use, but that's all you can use? Or are you allowing them to bring their own ideas, their own ways of doing things to the table? So how well are marginalized voices included? How much power of decision making do they have? And how do we enhance their capability to be able to participate fully if they've never done that before? Because, for example, the case of Equity Unbound is an open, connected intercultural curriculum that is equity focused. Basically, 3 people from US, Ireland, and myself came together and we said we want our students to interact with each other interculturally, but we're making the course open to others. It's a process-centric curriculum, but it also contains content. And what we do is, even though the content is initially created by the teachers, students and open participants can contribute more content and it evolves. So the teachers are not the only ones who are creating content. And also, when we choose content, the content is intentionally social justice oriented. So who's represented in the content? We have Global South and people of color as the presenters, the videos and the articles are written and spoken by them. The topics ourselves are not value neutral. We start with talking about issues of social justice, empathy, bias, othering, equity, and so on. And then we move on to, as we discuss digital literacies in the digital world, talking about bias and algorithms and decolonizing the internet and things like that. And it's always open to critique and revision and iteration. And it grew into other elements beyond the original intention, which I'll show very, very soon. And what we think we've done is a critical approach to curriculum, both what we talk about and how we go about doing it. I'm going to stop here for a moment, give you a minute to look at this image. You've probably seen one like it before. If you want to put a comment in the chat about what you're seeing, you can go ahead and do that. I'll just pause for a second. You may have seen one that's very similar to it, right? Where I think people were watching the baseball match. But I like this one because of the Apple example. Because obviously what you see here is if you give everyone the same thing, they have different needs. And so maybe each person needs a different kind of accommodation, right? But beyond that, I think the problem is that not everyone needs an apple. What if someone wants an orange? Obviously, there's no such thing as an apple tree that produces oranges. Yeah. Yeah, I know that one, Diane. That's when you remove the barrier, it's called liberation, right? But I can't do the orange example with that one. So it's more difficult to explain what I'm going to say. The next one I think is really important is that maybe someone looks privileged, like the tall person here, but they need care. They don't need an apple. So sometimes there are invisible inequalities that we're not aware of. There can be someone who looks perfectly able, but they have dyslexia or they have anxiety or something like that we can't see. That is not poverty. That is not as obvious as someone who has a very clear disability or something like that. And it's also important to think about well-intentioned changes that are not systemic. So Sareen Khader has a beautiful article where she talks about this very well-known sort of trope about teaching a man to fish. But what if they don't have access to fish in their ocean? What happened to the fish in the ocean? What if there's been some systemic inequality that's caused that to happen? Could everyone mute, please? Because there's someone who has noise. The other thing to also keep in mind is that you can give someone agency, but they can end up perpetuating their own or other people's oppression if they don't know better. So I want to show you a way of looking at the portfolio of different things you do and trying to analyze what you want to keep doing and what you want to stop doing. And it's called eco-cycle planning. It's a liberating structure. If you've never heard of the liberating structures, you should check these out. And this particular one is based on complexity, science, and agricultural examples. And I've got a video of how you can work on it in groups together. So this infinity sign asks you to look at the portfolio of things you do. And I'm going to just use the annotation tool so that it's a bit easier for you to figure out what I'm looking at. So the first thing is you have things in your portfolio, if you're an academic developer or a teacher, things that you've been doing forever and they've been working well and you don't need to invest a lot of time in them. And those are at maturity. You just want them to keep going and you just need a manager to make sure they happen. But sometimes circumstances change, like COVID, or like you've started to look at things from a social justice perspective and you realize these things are no longer helping you and you're in this rigidity trap where you have things going, but they don't fit your purpose anymore. And you need to go into creative destruction. And renewal, think about what's a new idea to replace the old idea. So an example for me is when COVID happened, we stopped giving face-to-face workshops, we replaced them with online workshops, for example, because we can no longer be in the same room. I think that happened a lot with the conference industry as a whole, right? We stopped doing face-to-face conferences, we're now doing online conferences and people are experimenting with different ways. But when you have a new idea, you have lots of new ideas, and you've probably seen this when you've worked with people that never actually get born because of what we call the poverty trap. Like you're not giving them enough resources. So you need to sort of look at what is your purpose? What is in maturity that helps you meet your purpose? What isn't? Stop doing it, start thinking of new ideas, and then make sure you give it resources so that it can be born. And once you once you give birth to a new idea, how do you grow it into maturity? So this is just one model that I think helps a lot to think about what happens next. I like this quote from Masaru because I think imagination is a really important dimension of what we're doing. And central to the initiation of the transformative process. So we need to imagine what could be different. I'm going to pause for a second and ask you, in your own institution or role, what have you been doing? The adaptation during COVID? What did you stop doing that no longer made sense? What did you start doing? What are some things that you learned to do during COVID that you think you should continue doing beyond COVID? So I'm going to pause for a second to give some people a chance to type in the chat. Someone has typed in the chat about the eco-cycle that it gives they have an agricultural background, I think, and they can see now how that can be helpful to apply to teaching and learning. That's good to hear. Okay, nobody has typed anything, so I'm just going to say, for example, I think doing online workshops is something we should continue doing. Okay, there's more people typing now. Let me take a look at what they're saying. More contact with your network. Yeah, that's true. You can have a wider network too, right? There are easier and quicker and cheaper things to ways to achieve things online. That's true that you can maybe use beyond that. Went back to literary engage with pedagogy. You need to keep up, right? So your professional development sort of accelerated, I think, as a teacher. Greater focus accessibility. Accessibility becomes even more important online. You have to be more deliberate about it. The need to reduce social isolation is much harder now, and you need to put a lot more effort. You delivered Zoom. Stop being able to feel how a group responds. That's, yeah, I understand what you're talking about, Ariane. It's hard. Online validation events, cost effective for the institution, also agree. That's true, the OU were already online all the time. So just more care. I think the care, emphasis on care has been really important. And Jill is saying that wouldn't work that way. Start offering things online that you thought might not work. That's true. All right, I'm going to move on for the interest of time, but I hope you all are having time to listen. No more travel between campuses. That's true. So maybe I think remote work is going to have a different reputation after this. All right, so with Equity Unbound, what we did is we started as this curriculum just between our students and our courses, but open to anyone else to participate. But when COVID happened, we're like, oh my God, we need to move online with care, which someone in the chat had mentioned. And we started crowdsourcing resources for that. And we started having sessions with educators and students. And some of these were recorded and some of them weren't. And it wasn't our original intention, but it's what people needed. And then the Black Lives Matter resurgence happened, and we started a socially just academia project. The first session of that was about inclusive citation. And then the group of us were asked to keep working on this, and we just changed the name from inclusive because inclusive has so many problematic connotations in the ways that inclusion is not always done in a socially just manner. And then what happened is something similar to what Ariane was talking about right now, which is we realized as COVID continued and as summer progressed close to the semester we're in now, people were still worried about how am I going to build community online when I start my semester fully online for people who are not like the OU, who have not been teaching online all the time. So we created these community building resources, like how do you build community online? And if you've never seen these resources, I'm going to put them for you in the chat. You can take a look at them later, but there are videos and text of telling people how would you build community online? How do you do introductions for the first time virtually? How do you warm up a lesson? How do you put people in breakout rooms and have a productive conversation? And I think we're following what Bell Hooks says, which is our job as educators is not just to give them information, but to also be involved in the intellectual and spiritual growth of students and to care for their souls. And especially with this online resource that what was happening with this community building resource is that we wanted to care for the teachers so that they could care for the students, so that they could have a better experience. And these very difficult times where socio-emotional needs are really high. And I'm very close to being out of time and I have a lot of slides, so I'm just gonna move on from here real quick. Intentionally equitable hospitality is the idea of when you're in an online space, you're the host of that space, building it. It's a responsibility to decide whom to involve and how much to make each person welcome. And it's also important to recognize the inequities that are there, try to have a systemic solution to address every person's inequities, not just say all people are welcome. I'm going to move on from here real quick, but just to let you know that the community building resources that we created have adaptations for every single one of them. You know, if you can't meet your students synchronously, here's how you can do it asynchronously. If you're synchronous but you don't have breakout rooms, here's how you can do the activity. If you want to do it and students can't turn their camera on for whatever reason, here's how you can do it with chat. The other thing that I think happened with the move to online is this local and open professional development opportunities. You no longer have to do everything locally because everyone's doing the same thing, so you can learn from each other. And these local and global learning communities for teachers, for students, for mixed groups, you need to think about intentionally equitable hospitality as you do them so they don't get dominated by the dominant majority of people. And especially when you put teachers and students together. I was just in a session yesterday where we had that, and you need to be really careful to make sure student voice is well heard. And no size fits all, so it's really important to offer different things. Some people need more structure, some people need less structure. Some people with the pandemic and the trauma need more structure than they would normally need. So this model sort of shows you that an online professional development activity can be more structured or less, can be more playful or more serious, can be more process or content-centric. And there are ways to do things that are dual pathway where different people can learn through it in different ways. And so these are two papers that will talk about this if you want to follow this a little bit more. I think the important thing, I'm remembering something that Ben Williamson said yesterday about personalization and the use of AI for personalization. This has been discourse that we've been hearing for a long time, which frankly really gets on my nerves, because why do we want a machine to tell people how to make judgments? Shouldn't we build their agency, help them make informed, critical choices for their own development with support? So learning from others in their community rather than hearing their recommendations and figuring out how to look for things on their own, rather than have an AI tell them what they like. You know what that's like when Netflix keeps recommending things to you, and that's, you're thinking, this is not really a good thing that I want to see, or it's making me go down a particular route, but I want to change. And so these are different online communities that give these different options. I'll talk about DigFin specifically. These were a group in Egypt, a cohort in Egypt that were mine. I met them locally, but they also met with groups in the US and several different universities. We had some synchronous sessions, we had some blogging, we had some Slack, so they could interact globally or locally, synchronously and asynchronously, text-based and video. So there were lots of different options for how they learn, as long as they were within the topics that we were talking about each week. I'm almost done. I just think it's really important to think as educational institutions, how much agency and support institutions offer to teachers to help them embody their teaching philosophy online rather than do a standardized thing, and how to shift their assessments to alternative ones, which is a really huge shift for a lot of people as a paradigm. And these are my last couple of slides, because I had sustainability in my title. I think putting care at the center of everything and centering social justice helps sustain something. But I also like this model a lot, talking about how you need vision, incentives, skills, resources, and a plan in order to have sustainable change. But if you miss something like vision, you cause confusion. You miss incentives, you create resistance. If you miss skills, everybody will be anxious. If you miss out on the resources, you'll create frustration. And if you miss a plan, you'll be like on a treadmill, like running after yourself. So you need to check what you're trying to do and make sure that you've given it everything it needs to succeed. All right, I am done. I just would love people to share in the chat. I know this was going really fast. Tell me, what was the most useful thing that you've learned today that you'd like to keep thinking and talking about from this session? And I will just put up here my email, my Twitter handle, and the link to these slides in case you want to use them again for whatever you like. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maha.
Yeah, thank you too for listening.
That was fantastic.
Thank you, Nona, go ahead.
I appreciate that. Was a whistle-stop tour, and I'm sure we're going to unpack a number of the points that you've made in the questions. And I see already some of the questions coming in and in the chat function. So if you could unshare your screen now, Maha, that would be fantastic. I'd like to invite now Nona to do her presentation, and then afterwards we will pick up the questions and some of the themes that have come up in the chat. Nona, can I invite you to present, please? Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. Yep, Just checking everyone can see the screen here.
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you, Mar. That was a fantastic insight for me. And what I'm going to do is build a little bit on what Mar was saying around the inclusive curriculum. And my presentation really is on narrowing the awarding gap through the adoption of an inclusive curriculum framework. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Students at Teaching at Solent University in Southampton, but I'm also really proud to be the chair of the Higher Education Race Action Group. And I'm particularly keen to hear from advocates who have made a difference in their institution and who are really proud of some of the changes that they've made possible through the work they've been doing. And I often call it leading from the middle rather than leading from the top. So please do share some of your experiences in the chat if you can. My story really is about the Black, Asian minority, ethnic undergraduate home students and the awarding gap. So for me, it's really important to think about this particular group of students. And I've been really thinking about it for a number of years. So if I look back at my history of working in equalities, I think it's roughly about 12 years since I've been working on this agenda, and the awarding gap has still remained. So universities are supposed to be transformative places. Going to university is supposed to be opening doors, supposed to be thinking about new ways of seeing the world. And I love this quote from Nicola Dandridge, because it really summarizes what we should get out of university and the problem. So the problem is that Black, Asian, minority ethnic students have an awarding gap, which is roughly 13.2%. That means the group, the awarding gap, for those of you who don't know it, particularly our international audience, it's the group of first and 2-1s, white students compared to BAME students who get a first and 2-1 in their undergraduate degree. So what this represents is roughly 81% of white students receive a first and 2-1, compared with roughly 68% of students who from BAME backgrounds receive a first and 2-1. And that means that there's a 13.2 roughly percentage point attainment gap. So that's the problem that really for me was a really nutty, persistent problem. And I was really keen to try and understand what was causing it. So that's the problem. And here we've got now how I think it's important to use the right data in order to spearhead some change. And for me, it's really important to be evidence-based. Understanding what the problem and highlighting it is important. Using data to shine a light on really where the inequalities are is also important. And so this metric really is a very different metric, a very different way of looking at attainment. You can look at it not just in terms of ethnicity, you can look at it in terms of disability, people, gender, you can look at it in a multitude of ways. So you can analyze value added. So what this score does is it takes 5 years of sector data and it looks at tariff point entry and subject to study. Tariff point entry is incredibly important because it is the major determinant of good degrees or first 2-1s. And therefore, coming in with a tariff point that is high is more likely to get you a first or 2-1. So you can see there is something called the explained gap, which is this line here. So there is a difference in this institution over a number of years between BAME students and white students in terms of the degree first and 2-1s they're expected to get. However, when you map on what they actually get, using 5 years of sector data, comparing it to institution performance, looking at what students came in with the same tariff point entry, you can see that they did not get their value added score of 1, which means their predicted outcomes would have given them a degree classification of 1. So this is an incredibly powerful story because it really busts the myth around the student deficit model, where people were talking about, oh, it's the tariff points that students come in, it's about the student, it's about, problematizing the BAME student or problematizing other groups of students. And by looking at this, and you can bring it down to course subject level, you can see actually it isn't. It's about the institution. It's about the experience that students have whilst they're in higher education, because they came in with the tariff points that they should have got a value-added score of 1. So you can see in this institution, white students were getting more white students were getting a first and 2-1 than they were expected compared to their tariff points. But still, even though this institution has improved, you can see still there is some work to be done. So that's a really important light, and it does look at the attainment gap or the awarding gap in a very different way. So, okay, the problem was the awarding gap. The data used the right type of data. For me, that's incredibly important, really to challenge some of the conversations around the problemizing of the students. And then the approach. So for me, I knew that if I was going to make sustainable change, it had to be something that was institutional. And so I was systematic in terms of looking at complex issues, which require research-informed approaches. When you're dealing with lots of different people, it's really important to actually think about what matters to them, what will work. So adopting a multifaceted longitudinal approach to institutional change that takes account of cultural complexity was described by Van der Ven et al. In 1999 and others as well in 2004. However, the other thing that was really important to do is to plan a process, but to also think about enhancing knowledge and skills of staff. So enhancing knowledge and skills of staff takes effort, takes absolutely a lot of effort and commitment to explore issues of race and racism with staff, and to really challenge perceptions, not in a destructive way, but in a way that takes people with you. So you are exploring issues of inequalities, exploring issues of race and racism and the literature around it, and staff are becoming familiar with that in relation to their discipline area. And really better supporting students. So rather than just having these global approaches, we need to understand who is benefiting from these different areas. And it's really important to make sure that we evaluate our impact of our student activities on which groups benefit. So who is benefiting from interventions? Here, you can see that this was the institutional approach. Improve institutional processes, enhance knowledge of skills, and better support the BAME students. And you can see the inclusive curriculum was a major element of that, as was the course meetings to raise awareness of inclusivity, of the gap. So an inclusive curriculum for me is really important to understand. And I've taken this quote from Hocking, Christine Hocking, which describes inclusive learning and teaching in higher education by referring to a way in which pedagogy, curriculum, assessment are designed and deliver to engage students in learning that is meaningful, relevant, and accessible to all. And so really for us, it was really important for myself and my colleague Annie Hughes to think about how we could help staff understand how in practical terms they could build inclusivity into their practice. So inclusion is widely espoused as an institutional value and or focus for pedagogy and academic practice. But in my experience, people have struggled with the practical applications at all levels of an institution. So they focus on teaching, but what about the rest? Because the student experiences everything. They go when they walk into a university physically or virtually. So in my view, institutions needed to respond to hyperdiversity in a systematic and systemic way, hence the creation of the ICF, which is the Inclusive Curriculum Framework. So the potential advantages of an inclusive curriculum are that A, it clarifies institution goals for inclusion, B, provides inspiration for transformational change, and C, offers beneficial outcomes for students and society by simplifying and sense-making complex and abstract perspectives of equality and inclusion and equity into a rubric like the framework that we've used, but it can have practical utility in all discipline contexts, as we have seen. So my vision for an inclusive curriculum is to ensure equity all the way through the student journey, at all levels and for all characteristics, so that we value diversity as an inherent educational value and an inherent strength to an institution. So you will see along here that there are 3 principles here. So I want to go through them just to give you a sense. So in principle 1, which is create an accessible curriculum, we are talking about accessibility both physically and conceptually. So in terms of methods of delivery, educational technologies and e-learning, as we've seen, can help to improve access by supporting flexible part-time study, distance learning, modularized learning, and which may suit mature students and students with caring responsibilities, jobs or other commitments, and particularly through times like COVID. However, we need to, as Maha said, we need to balance e-learning because we need to support it with a package of care. E-learning doesn't suit all students, and it can result in feelings of isolation, alienation, frustration, or dissatisfaction, and ultimately withdrawal. So educators need to use accessible language and literacies and take into account preferred ways of communicating and cultural learning styles, as well as physical access. An accessible curriculum also makes concepts of higher education accessible. It doesn't presume that students come with that knowledge. In an inclusive curriculum, students' learning should be about content, but also about how to understand academic concepts, such as academic intelligence, critical thinking, expertise, merit, reputation, gravitas, which can serve to divide or position them within an academic hierarchy. So principle 2 here is to enable students to see themselves in the curriculum. And it's really important to speak to narratives like, why is my curriculum white here, and decolonising the curriculum, but broader than that as well, to encompass LGBT and other demographic groups. And to ensure that students are co-creators is absolutely important here, so they are not alienated or disadvantaged by a curriculum that's not relevant to them or excludes their culture, experience and values. So an inclusive curriculum must create a strength of belonging through multiple aspects of citations, reading lists, case studies, choice of assessment topics, the freedom to choose what those topics are, assessment and module choices, program choices even. So it emphasizes students' personal learning objectives and ambitions and encourages feedbacks and views about learning from students. At a more profound level, issues of cultural access relate to whether students' cultural backgrounds are acknowledged or accommodated in the curriculum. And staff really do need to be conscious of the grand narratives and patterns of privileged knowledge, for example, Eurocentric, colonial, westernized knowledge, that are carried into the design of the curricula to the advantage of some groups of students, whilst preventing others from fully engaging. So raising students' awareness of the partial and subjective nature of disciplinary knowledge means they're more able to critique what is accepted as important and legitimate knowledge. Co-produced approaches can involve students and other stakeholders directly and actively in improving the relevance of a curriculum design and, of course, the course content. So moving on to principle 3, which is equip students with the skills to positively contribute and work in a global and diverse environment. So an inclusive curriculum considers, as I said, student diversity as an inherent educational value. Inclusive strategies and learning approaches enable engagement and shared learning to build student confidence and competence to engage in the classroom, in the workplace as well, and more importantly, in society. And this principle speaks to employability indeed, but it also speaks to other agendas such as the ethics and sustainability agendas. Students who interact with people from different backgrounds develop diversity competencies and are better able to value and collaborate with others from a variety of cultures, backgrounds and position in all walks of their lives. So an inclusive curriculum should offer opportunities for mixing with students, learning about and appreciating their perspectives and experiencing, and recognition and reward for student contributions to learning can encourage students to value their own contributions as well as the contributions of others. And they need to carry this value of others into the workplace, into the decisions about who gets promoted, what products to invest in, what countries to invest in, who to send to those different countries to solve problems, etc. So in this slide, you can see that these three principles can be applied to the concept of teaching, the content, i.e. case study. So what you teach, the session topic, how you sort of the content, what case studies you use, what questions you ask, what discussions you agenda, how you navigate students through some very tricky discussions around equity. In the delivery, how you bring groups together, in this informal assessment that teachers are always carrying out, who has learned and who hasn't, in the assessment, in the feedback, how do we build understanding of the topic areas? And in the review, as teachers, we're always reflecting on our sessions when we walk out of it, what went well, what we didn't. But we also need to ask ourselves, which group of students learned, which groups of students did I test that learning, and which groups of students, in my opinion, didn't. So that's kind of the framework, and it can be applied at teaching session. So at module level, and the same applies in the module concept. What is it we're teaching? Inequalities of economics. In the content, the learning outcomes, the reading lists. In the delivery, the learning and teaching strategy we're using. In the assessment strategy. In the module feedback strategy. And in the module review. Using data to see who learned and who didn't. And at this, it isn't a tick box exercise, but in a way it is. To what extent is this module delivering those three principles? And also in terms of the program, or the kind of the course level. So in the concept, the program specification. So I've seen some really fantastic courses now being advertised which appeal to global audiences. In the content, how those groups of modules are packaged together to deliver those three principles. In the learning and teaching strategy, how are we delivering our curriculum in a way that is accessible, that does enable our students to receive themselves. In the assessment strategy, exactly ensuring that we are preparing students to effectively contribute. So what are those skills gaps in the market? How are we assessing those? And then how are we teaching them? And in the feedback strategy, how are we building cultural competence, skills competence in our students through the assessment strategy and through the way in which we're feeding back to students. And again, in the evaluation of the program, using data and evidence base that analyzes performance by demographics to understand who we are improving. And at university level, so it is important for me to say that at university, a student is really experiencing everything. So at a university level, how is the university creating a curriculum in terms of co-curriculum as well as teaching, enabling students to see themselves within the university and equipping students to positively contribute? And this is about seeing themselves as valuable and others seeing students who are diverse as valuable. And here we've got quite a lot of things going on. But if I give you an example here, is what we've got. We put early stakes, low assessments across all courses in the university to ensure that we were getting feedback to students and targeting students within 5 weeks of their program start for level 4, for the first year of undergraduate delivery. Offering flexible accommodation appeals to commuter students who don't want to be travelling 3 or 4 hours a day, particularly across London or whatever, but it shows the way in which we enable students to access our university recognizing the diversity and the fact that they are different types of students, and having a motel-type accommodation which will allow them to stay overnight or bring their families in order to access 2 days of teaching without having to go home after each session. I also want to just add here that it's really important to understand that a student's journey is influenced by the culture of the lecturer, the culture of the dean, the culture of the vice-chancellor's team, which includes the finance director, the HR director, the vice-chancellor themselves, and the culture of the sector, and of course, the culture of the government. All these are influencing, and I could have done a framework like this for the next level, which is the sector level. So what does this look like in practice? And here's some examples of how people have used the framework to change their practice. So it could go from minor modifications or changes that require no modifications to whole-scale curriculum changes. And here are some examples. So we've got curriculum practices which were changed to enable female students to fully participate in physiotherapy education, demonstrating these and making accommodations that enable diverse groups of students to contribute fully to the workplace and society. Barriers are often put in place for students that actually are just because we've always done things this way, not really thinking about problem solving. And academics are problem solvers. They're researchers about solving problems, but applying that problem solving to a student learning is a really important exercise as well. And I just want to say here that Mumbai Dabbawalas is a fantastic case study where students from India could see themselves in something that validated their really excellent practice. And they got the global Sigma 6 award, which is very scarce, for winning for the process of delivering home-cooked food to office workers using an infallible coding system and distribution methods. And this case study is a logistics management case study, but it validates the Global South contribution and shows them as excellent contributors to world practice. Taking Race Live is a really fantastic piece of work, and my colleague Sonia Sharma has developed a really fantastic case study which looks at taking race into different discipline areas. And in semester 1, the project is introduced to students on participating modules. Staff take turn at co-teaching modules to provide students with theoretical perspectives from each discipline and opportunities to take field trips in teams. In one area, it was about drama and sociology, looking at the history of hair, black hair, which was fantastic, and the students then presented to the university. Business students were asked to complete a marketing project after they were looking at the inclusive curriculum and thinking really about how they could really prepare students for employability, but also hitting our diversity agenda for the Royal Air Force. And students was charged with developing a recruitment strategy to improve the recruitment of men and women from BAME backgrounds. BAME alumni at my current institution were invited to partner with university to increase the guest speakers and live brief relevant for BAME students, really increasing the confidence, but also showcasing to the communities and raising aspirations, but showcasing the contributions those alumni made to their respective fields. Drama students are seen as co-producers of knowledge, adding insight into decisions about the curriculum and choices of actors playing parts, particularly after the Black Lives Matter, where students are actually ahead of the lecturer and in terms of understanding the challenges of marginalisation of Black actors in the roles. So it's really important here to look in terms of fashion and hair and makeup. They incorporated design histories that reflect BAME experiences, BAME scholars and BAME alumni to act as mentors, but also to talk about experiences in the industries. And it's really important not to marginalise this to a module but students are taught as Black hair, makeup and hair as part of a core program and part of their learner journey from level 4. So I really want to say that we must ask ourselves whether the pluralist identities in our classrooms are reflected in our pedagogies. It is particularly noticeable on courses where a large proportion of students are from countries outside Britain, but the canon of work, the absence of a multilingual approach, the emphasis on received pronunciation and conservative casting do not always serve all our students well. So my story was about the role of inclusive curriculum in improving BAME outcomes. And I can actually say that the inclusive curriculum was a key component of the way in which we narrowed the attainment gaps for BAME students. And I'd just like to conclude there. Thank you for listening. Wow, that was really fast, sorry.
Thank you so much, Nona. That was really, really interesting. And I'm sure, and I can see from both the chat and the questions that our audience were also enthralled in both presentations. And I'm sure we could carry on this conversation for the rest of the day. So I think we should get on to some of the questions. One of the first questions, Maha, from your presentation earlier, that I was going to ask, but I see it's come up 2 or 3 times in the chat as well, is around that comment that you made that inclusion is not always socially just. And the audience and myself were wondering if you could unpack that a little bit so that we can pick up where you're coming from.
Yeah, so it goes down to the Desmond Tutu quote, is that a lot of times people from the dominant hegemonic majority will invite someone, I'll give specific examples in a second, will invite someone who is a minority to the table, and there might be 2 things wrong with it. The first one is they might be the only minority in the table. And so if there's a table with 10 people, you're the only minority, you don't really have a voice in the middle of all that. The second thing is the standards are already set, like the way of working is already set, and the minority has to just be included into what already exists, as if what already exists is great, and where, the minority is lucky to be included into it. So one example of that is, for example, if you are, I've been part of, I'm not going to say the name of the report, but it's International Educational Technology Report that is mostly US centric. And they have 100 people voting. First of all, they set the system. So people who come in who are from different backgrounds who have suggestions for how to do it, they don't tweak it a lot based on your suggestions. The second thing is, at some point, I was the only person from the Middle East and Africa in the entire group of 100 people. And so I was representing all of that, and I had only 1 vote, and I had no right to change the way they were doing it. So I was trying to tell them that this doesn't really mean it's international. If you have 50 people from the US and then 50 people from different countries, you haven't really included them. That's an example of that. Another example is to tell your students that you'll include them in the curriculum design, but they don't know any other way. They've never had that kind of power before, so they come up with very traditional curriculum choices. And I see Nona is nodding to that. Maybe she has examples of this as well. Like you need to sort of empower them to be able to make those decisions.
I think it would be helpful, Nona, if you came in there too, because we've had quite a few people asking specifically around that question of how we do include students and how do we empower them to make their contribution, to ensure that their contribution is valued and they don't feel, as Maha's was saying, that it's almost lip service or we're following a process that we think we need to follow.
Yeah, and I think there are a number of ways to do this, and really you have to look at the context. I can give you a couple of examples. So one of the examples was we brought in inclusive curriculum consultants, which were students, and we paid them because we recognised that some of us, we wanted to make sure we appealed to a wider audience of privileged students. And we trained them in the framework, and we gave them the expertise and used them to support the students in understanding what inclusivity looked like. And if you look at that, remember that diagram I showed you about a whole piece of work, what it's got to be doing is that you're equipping course leaders with course reps with the understanding of what an inclusive curriculum looks like, so that they are encouraging their students. You have to use multiple approaches and constantly. Otherwise, you won't hit the students. You have to equip the staff with the skills to facilitate such conversations. And this is a journey because one of the things that staff have got to do is read the literature on barriers to participation, confidence building, inequalities. They have to understand the challenges and give up some of their power to the students. And so they have to facilitate rather than lead from the front. So the other thing is, and recently I'm engaging, is bringing in particular areas where there is issues, a facilitated conversation through the academic development team into the classrooms with those groups of students where we can see that there is some quite clear discrepancy using the value-added score. So you have to use a multiple of interventions. You cannot stop. It has to keep continuing because each group of students is new, so you have to keep that process going. So not an easy one. And I found that students leading other students is the best way forward.
So just to follow up on that, both yourself and Maha, creating a sustainable, embedded institutional culture is obviously where we would all want to be. And I'm guessing from both of your experiences, it would be interesting to understand where you see, you've mentioned one of the challenges around engaging students, staff, reading, but were there particular challenges or particular bits of advice you could give those of us in the audience that to avoid, that would help us be successful moving forward?
Maha, do you want to go first or do you want me to go?
I think you go first for this one and I'll continue on after.
So the first thing is you've got to get your Vice Chancellor's team on board. But more importantly, you have to get your Board of Governors on board. And they are ultimately responsible for attainment and the academic fabric of the institution and the culture. So in a way, if you could get the board looking at the data, that is a powerful thing. So what I do is I present the board with the data. Now, if you can't access the board, what you've got to start doing is leading from the middle. So when I started leading from the middle, I just presented the data everywhere that I could. And getting the value-added data actually was the most powerful thing because it made the institution see that BAME students did not do well coming to their institution. And that is an important message. I.e., if you come to here, you are less likely to do well than if you went to another institution. And working with the student union is incredibly important and skilling them up to put pressure in the board because they're there. So I have to go back to my whole circle. You have to take that very systemic and systematic approach. You can't just come in at one angle. You need the whole picture. Academic progression, recognition, all those things. You've got to embed equality into that and equity and outcomes of their students. So if people are going for promotions, they've got to speak to their results and their improvement in their metrics. And therefore, the biggest difference I made was making the awarding gap a KPI. Okay. At board level.
That is amazing achievement. Maha, that's an amazing achievement. I was going to say something quite similar to yours in the sense you have to build a coalition. So I'm going to give a smaller example of that because in my institution, we don't have as many students who have the kind of issues that you would have in the UK, for example. But if I take accessibility in terms of disabilities, right? You need to build a coalition of the folks from your Student Wellbeing Center who understand how to deal with disabilities, both mental, social, psychological, and physical disabilities. You need your IT people to also be on board to help out with technical solutions to disabilities. And then you need someone to be helping the faculty or the teachers with how do they help work with disabilities. And you need professors to support each other. So you need coalitions of people so that you have people at different levels of the organization, those at the top who are supporting the strategy, prioritizing the strategy as part of the institutional culture. And then you need people in the middle who are providing the actual on-the-ground support for other people who are trying to do the work. Because the institutional culture is not going to change in a minute, even if you change the outcomes or the KPIs. You need to work at all the levels. And I think Nona's already talked about all these different levels. The other thing I think you need to keep in mind is Nona was talking about letting students lead, but even within the students, there's power imbalances, right? So there's intersectionality. So if you have students working together, there are still students within those groups that have more power than others. And students may not be as aware of, and I'm sure there are some students here and they could talk about that, but like if you put students in groups of 4 and the teacher's not there, it doesn't mean that there's no power there. There's no teacher power. But there's power of student race, there's power of gender, there's power of sexuality, there's power of economic differences, right? So all these things are still there. And so you need to help them become aware of that as well and to take that into account as they work together and try to help them find ways to equitably listen to everyone's voice. And this sometimes listening to minority voices might mean silencing dominant voices for a little bit so that the minority voices get heard properly. Because the dominant voices are heard all the time anyway. And just giving that equal time to the minority and the dominant voices doesn't solve that problem.
It's really, really interesting. And just to follow on there, one of our members of the audience is asking, often people ask, what can I do on a day-to-day basis? You know, recognizing what you've both said about getting institutional buy-in and board of governors buy-in, but for individual members of staff, what advice would you give to teaching staff on the ground?
So it depends on who you are and how much influence and power. I just sort of started answering, sorry.
No, that's cool. That's cool. Absolutely fine.
Okay, wherever you have power and influence and control, so you can definitely do things with your own students, right? And then with your own peers and the conversations that you have with your peers and seeking others in the institution who can be allies will help you so much, because doing this work alone is extremely exhausting. And if you can find people within your institutions, for me, I go to Twitter and I find people there and I help myself grow in that area so that I can do better. But also not being afraid to lead with your values, because for the longest time as an academic developer, I was told, stop talking about those values that you have. And when COVID happened, I decided that I'm not going to listen to that anymore. And it made all the difference. They listened. They let me do it. So don't be afraid to be very explicit about your values and where you're coming from and everything that you're working. If you're in like a governance thing, like in my university senate, I will speak up about gender issues. I will speak up about these things. I'm not going to just let it happen, you know. And then you will find allies. You will find a lot of resistance, but you will find allies. And when you're more open about what you do and what your values are, it'll be easier for people to know that you're that person, and it'll be easier for them to approach you. Be the person if you can, if it's not going to cost you your job. Like, obviously we're not all equally vulnerable. If you are able, be open about your values as much as you are able in every circle of control you have and every circle of influence you have in whatever voice you can. You know, if it can be writing, if it can be tweeting, if it can be private conversations. Nona, I'm sure you have a lot of.
I think you've covered the teaching really well, and I do think it's about kind of bringing. You know, I had a few people who are so committed to socially just agendas, whatever you want to however you want to phrase it, and they have made a huge impact on their course teams. So individually, they've been able to raise the performance of their course teams by just saying, oh, this is what I've done and this is my experience, and really bringing people on board. But, you know, people in quality, and I know there's somebody in quality here because, Maya, you raised that point, raised that idea. So I think people in quality have a huge position of power, because they can say, well, how do we ensure that through validations, the right sorts of questions are being asked? And how do we train people to ensure that they know, like chairs of panels, to know what good socially just curriculum looks like, or inclusive curriculum looks like, so they have huge positions of power to bring in externals to brief their own teams and to brief the chairs. So, you know, those people have powers as well. And if you're in finance, unbelievably, you have a huge role to play. Investment in the equity agenda is incredibly important. There has to be, I call it race budgeting to improve race equity, budgeting to improve disability equity. I did a lot of work around disability in my institutions, and that requires funding. So in each part, you can ask the questions, you know, whatever role you are in, how do we know which of our students are doing well? Can I have the data? Who is producing the data? Ask the questions. people are problem solving, but they need to understand what the problem is, get the right data, and then agree the approach. Those are the three things that I think you can take away from this. In any role, you can do that.
That's really, really helpful. I think this is might have a short answer, might not have a short answer, Nona. It's very specific around at a granular level. Have you done any work through the framework at a very granular level around performance? And do strategies used in universities like anonymous marking have an impact?
So we did look at anonymous marking. We implemented it, and we looked at the impact on grades afterwards. And there was some impact, obviously, on that. So at a granular level, you can definitely look at things like marking, anonymous marking. You can look at things like first time early low stakes assessment, and does that make a difference in the actual changes to the mark for the first assessment compared to previous years? So you can look at the difference and analyse it by different demographic groups. Granular information is really important to understand who is doing well. Some of the investments we've made around direct support to students, we've looked at the investment, which group of students are benefiting, and benefiting compared to their counterparts who didn't take part in that initiative, and using tariff point entry so that we're not just looking at those who would have done well anyway. So you can use that granular data. It requires you to work very closely with your MI team and for them to buy into providing this data. But I always talk about value for money. Why would an institution want to invest in initiatives that are not benefiting the groups of students? And this is where your access and participation plan is incredibly important, because you have to demonstrate improvements. So you have got a kind of a buy-in from your MI team there, because they should be providing that kind of evaluation anyway.
Thank you. And that kind of takes us into, there's been a little bit in the chat and the questions around values, and you both referred to values at different points, and a mix around in the current situation that we find ourselves in with the global pandemic. Are there things that we need to think about in terms of organisations around the values of groups of students, around culture, around the institution? Do we need to have those conversations about our shared values at an early stage in order to be able to have genuine impact across institutions and not just in pockets of institutions? Maha, I don't know if you want to come in first.
Ideas here too. I don't know if this answers your question, but I mean the overarching view that I take is that if institutions want teachers to be able to achieve particular impact, they need to work on giving them the agency and the resources and the skills they need to be able to do that. So if we're going to talk about something like how Ben was talking about this yesterday, Ben Williamson, about proctoring technologies, right? Surveillance technologies, reproduce a lot of inequalities of class and race. If you want to stop your teachers from that, how much do you empower them to do something instead of that? How much as an institutional policy do you make it not to do that, but also to empower them to do something different, give them the skills they need, give them the support they need? Because also teachers themselves are especially with COVID, they're also working more than usual, and there's a lot of uncompensated labor going on in that space. And then the other thing is there's also inequalities between people who work within the institution, right? So especially these days, there's a gender inequality that's huge because in most families, and I think it's the same all over the world, where, for example, people with children, the women are the ones who are responsible for a lot of what's happening at home rather than the men, even if both are working from home, for example. I don't know if this answers your question, and I'd love to hear what Nona has to say.
Actually, Valerie, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question.
Given the we've done a lot of soul searching around how organisations are responding to COVID-19 and the impact it's having on individuals, and the impact is not equal across our society. And the question is really around, when we start to unpack some of these boxes in our organisations, do we need to have had the conversation about what our values are as an organisation, not just as an individual, but as an organisation? Do we have a collective set of values or not? And is that something that you feel we should, as organisations, engage in if we are genuinely going to have sustainable change?
Yeah, and I think that's, thank you for repeating that. I think I was so busy listening to Maya, I forgot what the question was, but it's really important. And, I'm really proud of Solent University in Southampton, because we did have that conversation about, what was important, what was fundamentally our most critical top 3 values during time of COVID. And it was really something that made me feel very comfortable being in an organisation like that during this time. So we were committed to understanding the inequalities of different groups of students, the digital divide, understanding that our health and safety of our students was paramount, and that we would take the losses that go with that, making those things, that financial sustainability, of course, was important, but we would sacrifice a lot to ensure that our students were given early information, even if it cost us, and that they were given flexibility and accommodation, that they were given choices, etc. So some of the things that we discussed, it was financial hardship, digital divide, which was accentuated by a virtual university, implicit bias and racial harassment being quite still evident in a virtual space, that some of our students who had issues of self-belonging would find it even harder, but also recognising that it was what did provide safe spaces for some groups. Academic capital was being jeopardised because they didn't have those networks at home. They were losing the conversation in the corridors and the classrooms. But we knew that some of our more vulnerable students would drop out, and really thinking about the employability of those students who were from backgrounds where employment was already an issue. And so we again thought about that 3 cycle: improving institutional processes, digital bursaries, flexible accommodation, enhancing knowledge and skills of staff, inclusive learning environment. Our Transformation Academy really looked at the learner journey to try and make sure that we absolutely understood the lack of academic capital. We raised the awareness of, particularly around BAME students who were more vulnerable and who maybe have had more losses in terms of their families, training the advisors to be more understanding of the complexities around COVID, and also bringing our students on board to not saying these are the solutions for you, but helping them to us to understand what we should put in place was really important, so we were better supporting our students. And so we've done quite a lot of work in terms of supporting that. But we only did that because we sat down and said, these are our values, and what everything else can be pushed aside. And those were our priorities. So yes, Kath.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Question.
Can I just add something really quickly?
Sure.
Very quickly.
Sure.
Sometimes we have the conversations about the values, but then when it comes to the application, we don't embody the values, and people don't see that disconnect. I just was in a meeting yesterday. Empathy for students and so on, and then they made a decision that was like the complete opposite of that.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, from what we've both been saying, we absolutely need to be able to challenge. And I can say that because, just as we've been talking about power dynamics, I realise I'm in a privileged position and I can say things and people usually act on them. But it's important that you're able to challenge at every level in an organisation, regardless of what your title says you are or what role you perform in it. So I couldn't agree more. It's a question from our audience around safety, actually. And, that for those less powerful social groups and who may feel that external political or is silencing their voices, and, how do we ensure student and staff safety, both physical and psychological, when we encourage them to really challenge some of the inherent behaviours and ways of working that exist? Who would like to go first?
Okay, that's a really, and I do think that we have to have those constructive conversations. And if you go back to that circle I showed, and I said where the inclusive curriculum, but there was a line that said course team meetings. And I think that at a course level, there has to be a discussion about really challenging things like what's the role of a lecturer? How do you engage? How do you have the conversation? And creating the safe space for academics to have that thinking through. It's hard work. It's challenging, but unless you have those understanding of that it's something we need to do together, as opposed to you're the problem. So we stop problematizing the student and start problematizing the staff instead. And that takes a lot of work. And to be honest, I spent the best part of 2 years working with course teams just to get this conversation going so that they were on board rather than felt it was done to. So you need to have those. You have to have the framework. You have to draw upon the literature. You have to get them involved. And we use a course dashboard and a process in order to prioritize and to work with course teams. But it is a difficult one.
Okay. Maha?
I was thinking that mainly building trust takes time. And students especially, they will not trust a person because you put them in a position where they're supposed to be the people listening to them. They will trust someone who has taught them before and they found that they were caring, and they've had situations with them before where they found them to be trustworthy. So for example, in our institution, we have a new system for reporting on harassment, for example, okay? And students are saying, we're not going to go to this random person who's the head of managing these things. I don't know if I should trust that person, but I will go to a professor. But there needs to be a system that shows them that there will be more people accessible to them rather than one person who's in a bureaucratic position. So there has to be a systemic way to be able to do that, so that it's not random and that some people won't know who to go to or where to go and what to do with that. The other one is, I always hear this, like faculty saying, oh, the students didn't complain. Yes, they didn't complain to you because they're afraid of you and what you will do to them based on historical, they don't have power and they're afraid to complain or object lest you harm them. So there have to be sort of anonymous ways or ways to go to circumvent someone to be able to talk about a problem. And this is me just talking about problems, not even talking about asking them to even just do something without any challenges being there. But the thing is that a lot of people have already internalized a lot of oppression, that they don't believe that I think you said this in your presentation, something they don't even believe that their views matter or who they are matters in a particular space. So I think there has to be working and historically showing examples of how this has worked in the past whenever you have, so that others can see, oh, well, this group of people really mean what they're saying. They're not just saying it. And the more examples you have of saying it but not doing it, not walking the talk, the less people will trust you. And then your credibility goes down. I think that's also really important. But anonymous ways of reporting things, like in the same way that you mentioned anonymous grading, I think students, if they have a complaint, they need to have an anonymous way of reporting it as well, if possible.
And in a chat function, see that this thread's been picked up, and that we need to really be able to think about this as well. And maybe different challenges when we're working in cross-border situations in T&E environments, and where we're working with partners, where again, how we build the knowledge and skills of our staff and students to be really engaged in those environments as well, and be able to come to the table as equals, as we've been discussing. And that can be quite challenging. And I like the idea, Nona, that we need to make sure we don't start problematizing the staff as well as the students, as we've done in the past. We need to see the whole thing and shift the concept of our thinking away from there. There was a question from one of our colleagues in QA, actually, who was a project that was run by QA around the kind of focus on project in developing graduate skills. And one of the sections that you had in your framework, or you have in your framework, Nona, was around contributing in a global diverse environment. And that was one of the aspects of the project that students here had real issues with, and that they felt less confident in that. And again, I guess it's a question around from your experience, from both of your experiences, of how do we build that confidence. And it ties into an earlier comment around we might have to silence some voices, and we might have to try and encourage some voices. But if students themselves are saying they don't feel confident, you need to be confident to know when to be silent too. So from your own experiences, is there something that we could give some tips to our audience on how they can encourage that within their student populations?
We're both going.
I'm going to say something. Go ahead, Nana.
So I'm just going to talk about this experience I had with the pharmacy group of students. And we went in to work with the students really to understand some challenges around the pharmacy industry. And we showed some data which were showing that more females were entering pharmacy and females were tending to be less likely to invest in ownership of pharmacies, and therefore pharmacy was going to be a crisis. And so we used opportunities like that to draw out the conversations from different groups about the context of pharmacy, not the content, but the context. And through that, develop the skills of the course team and the students to really talk about how they would build the skills within the room, how they would value other people. So you have to sometimes engineer something that is context rather than content in the curriculum to have those conversations. And to be honest, that was a really effective discussion because it brought the students to act as a group because they understood the context was dependent on everybody in the room, sustainability of that pharmacy industry. But you have to engineer stuff like that. You can't just leave it to happenstance. So this is where I think that academic developers are really good at helping course teams to work through problems like that. But you have to think about it before you go in and just have an engineered conversation.
Really helpful. I'm going to give Maha the last word on this, and then we're going to bring the session to a close.
So very quickly, I'm going to give two very concrete pedagogical approaches that you can use when you're trying to structure conversations like these. One of them is the liberating structures. If you've never heard of them, the community building website has a section on liberating structures. You can see different ways of organizing conversations to promote equity in a conversation and to sort of help people open up gradually. And my experience with them, they've worked really well, especially when you have a lot of power imbalance in a space. The other approach is theater of the oppressed, which is more complex. It's based on pedagogy of the oppressed. It has so many different levels, but there's also a few videos in the community building resources for that. So hopefully that's a very concrete thing that people might try to do to engineer conversations that are equitable and that address these kinds of issues.
Thank you. Well, as we suspected when we started this session, we could have carried on talking for another hour easily. And I'm sorry to those in the audience whose questions we haven't been able to pose. And I am sure that I speak on behalf of the audience when I say thank you so much to both presenters, to Nona McDuff and to Maha Bali, whose presentations have really, really stimulated our thinking. I've learned a lot from both of you, and I'm sure I'll take back into my institution, as will the audience. If the comments are anything to go by, it's a fantastic presentation and a fantastic morning. So I just want to thank you all really, really very much and give my virtual claps to both of you on behalf of the audience.